Cause and effect. I think it is your fault. Somebody's, not mine. Anyway, asking why. So cause and effect is about asking why, and you want to figure out reasons and results. And that method is cause and effect. So why did something happen? And what might be the consequences of why that happened? If you think about this, and this is used often if you think about like accident investigation, for example. So if anytime an airplane crashes into the tarmac, not that I want airplanes to crash, right? They do an investigation. They said, why did this happen? This happened because, there are too many geese in the field next to the airport. Consequences, of course, is the geese get into the engines and it's a fiery crash. So, if you're trying to explain why things happen, you can expect to find a whole array of causes. So, if I use that same example, well, the cause is that part of the causes, or the part of the causes are there is a field that is next to the airport that is conducive to having geese land in it because there's still a farmer there and he has corn. So part of the cause is the airport failed to buy up all the land around that is necessary to avoid crashes like that. Another cause might be they built an airport, in the migration path of geese, for example. So this, as you can see, this can be a complex endeavor. There are a lot of potential causes and the effects can be myriad. So if to seek cause and effects is one way for the mind to discover order in a reality that otherwise might seem random and pointless. If you don't think cause and effect isn't important, don't go to the doctor because if you think about, and I'll give you an example of a heinous disease, and if you think about the plague, at one time the bubonic plague killed, half of Europe or near to, and they didn't know why it was. They thought it might have to do with witches, or it might have to do with water that wasn't clean, or whatever else. And ultimately, the cause, of course, is there are fleas that are on rats, and those fleas bite people, and they transmit the plague. Um, it's one of those things that is a very important example of understanding causes and effects. So when you write a cause and effect paper, first thing you want to do is make sure your subject is manageable. In other words, are there a few causes that are obvious and prominent and that you can speak to? If there are, if I said, for example, why is the stock market rising or falling? Well, I could break it down into a couple of, causes, but realistically, there's 100 different things that affect it. And unless you're an economist, you're really not going to understand those things. So you want to have something that's manageable. You want to consider your purpose. If reasonable people can disagree over causes and effects, which is often the case, you should go further and argue for one interpretation over the other. So, in other words, if something happens and there's multiple ideas about maybe it's this is the cause or maybe that's the cause. So, for example, let's say someone has a child and that child runs awry of the law. One cause might be poor parenting. Another cause might be the kid was dropped on his head when he was 3. Another reason might be he got in with the wrong group of people. Well, all those causes are possibilities. One or a couple of them are probably more prominent given the circumstances of that particular child, and those are the ones that you should argue for. And you should always remember to treat others fairly. So in other words, if you argue for one cause over another, particularly if the other cause is reasonable, you should at least speak to the fact that while I don't agree and here's why I don't agree, it's still a reasonable idea. Figuring out causal relations can be difficult. Was it the chicken or the egg, for example? Causes tend to be many, as we already talked about, and pretty complicated. So when there are a number of causes, you want to weigh them. You want to assign each a relative importance. If I say, why did I not catch trout today in the trout stream? There might be a whole number of causes. But which ones are the ones that are most important. If I was being loud and thrashing through the water, well, that cause, kind of supersedes all the other possible causes. And so if there's some things that are obvious or more obvious, those are the ones that you want to talk about. I guess the thing to remember is reasoning carefully is the key to good cause and effect methodology. So you want to think about things deeply, make some decisions, and then talk about the obvious causes that lead to certain effects. When you go to talk about discovery of causes, you want to consider, what am I trying to explain? What is the character, the personality of mental state of whoever acted? It's easy to ascribe certain motivations to people. That can be a pretty lazy way to do things. So you want to think about, really, what is the evidence? Why did they really do something? And is that truly the cause for this effect? In what scene, what venue, where did something happen? What instruments or means have been used? And for what purpose did the person or entity act? So when you think about causes, cause and effect doesn't necessarily mean this person, for example, this person had ill intentions and then see, we got this bad result. It might be that this person had great intentions and we got this bad result because of this, this, and this. So it's just something to think about. So that, as a kind of a checklist for cause and effect essay, the first thing you want to think about, have you been able to cover the subject adequately in the space allotted? Like I say, a big problem with cause and effect papers is people will bite off more than they can chew. Take a relatively small subject, something that is manageable, and then work through that. Do you have a thesis? Have you focused your analysis properly? So once again, it's about managing space, managing the argument. Is your argument complete? Have you concluded all relevant causes and effects? So, with anything that happens, there are usually a few causes, a few prominent causes that need to be covered. Have you been accurate and fair? Have you avoided oversimplifying for the sake of your argument? This is something that, if you listen to people talk about anything like politics or science or the local high school basketball team, people oversimplify. If I use an example, this year the Wisconsin Badgers basketball team is not doing as well as they have in the past. There are, frankly, a lot of causes, and some within people's control and some without people's control. And one argument that people will do is just say the coach isn't very good. Well, that's an oversimplification, and that's really not a good argument. And it's really, it could be one of the causes, but it's really not one of the most obvious ones. And finally, you want to be clear and concise. This is always the case in our writing, but it's very important with cause and effect. You don't want your argument to ramble. You want your argument to be a tight argument that makes sense and that shows this is an obvious cause to affect what I'm talking about.